Hello there, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm sharing one of the cards I created using some of the new Tim Holtz Sizzix dies and embossing folders. I start with a quick walkthrough of the new products, show you what is so different about the new embossing folders, and then I get into the making. This is a fun but quick background technique that can be done with just about any embossing folder you may have, and it's a great way to create a rusty, grungy effect. As always, I encourage you to shop your stash and see if you already have something similar that you can use. However, if you're interested in any of the products I'm using, you can find the supply list with links in the description box below. Just click on the word more to see more. When you shop through those links, you're supporting me at no extra cost to you, and I really appreciate that so very much. So the new Tim Holtz Sizzix dies and embossing folders are now available. And I know that Tim had said that, he's not doing any more product development or designing, but the Sizzix collection had already been in the works prior to that decision on his part. So there will be some Sizzix releases throughout the year, and I do believe Tim had mentioned that. But I just wanted to show you a little bit of some of the new products and then get into what I'm going to be making with some of them as well. So for this year, Tim is also continuing with the vault releases, and so he's gone back to some designs and products that were released in the past, and as Tim always does, he has reimagined them in new ways. And first up are 5 new embossing folders. And these are the multi-dimensional folders. So they're not 2D or like plain embossing folders, and they're not 3D embossing folders. They're kind of an in-between. So there's extra levels of texture and dimension in these folders as compared to the originals that came out from these. So just make it a little bit easier for you to see, I'm going to share with you the packaging so you can kind of see the embossing folder a little easier. So this is vault lace, vault gears, this is vault diamonds, vault airmail, and then vault flourish. So these are all A6 size embossing folders. So they're the same size as his normal embossing folders, but the big difference is the designs on these as compared to the originals. And I just happen to have one of the old original ones in my stash, and it's the vault lace. So I have the original lace one here, and it is just a simple, typical embossing folder that I remember from like back in the day. So I thought it would be interesting to share the difference between the original embossing folders and these new multi-dimensional folders. So I embossed some white cardstock with each one of the folders, and this one is embossed with the standard embossing folder. And as you can see, there's still a great amount of texture and interest there created with the embossing folder, and you could use either side. And then here is what happens with the 2D embossing folder. So you can see that there is just another little layer of dimension that's been added to this design, and you can see that on both sides here. So kind of again, that kind of little extra edging there that's been created. So it just adds another bit of dimension and texture to the design. So if you have the original ones, there's really not any need to go get these new ones unless you're just really wanting to add that extra dimension that you can get with this new design. So the only other difference is the size of the embossing folder. So this one fits more of a standard A2 size piece of cardstock, and this one fits a standard A6 size of cardstock. So it's just a teeny bit larger in length. Mostly the width is very similar, as you can see. And, you know, so if you're a collector of all things Tim Holtz, then yes, you might want to add these to your collection. Or if you don't have any of the original designs, you might want to add them to your collection as well. I myself am very excited because this is the only one that I have of any of his early embossing folders. So I'm looking forward to using these and having them in my collection to create with. So along with the embossing folders, Tim's added another sidekick order, and this one is called Vault Floristry, and it's got a small embossing folder that does like a honeycomb pattern, and then these floral die cuts. And this is designed to fit in the Sizzix Sidekick, which is just a smaller die cutting machine. This is great for somebody that doesn't do a lot of die cutting maybe, or is just wanting to get started with a little bit of die cutting and embossing. And this is kind of an easy way to kind of get into it without as much cost buying like a huge die cutting machine. This will work in any die cutting machine though. So if you've got the other Sizzix foldaways or a Switch or a Big Shot, you can use this in any of the machines or any other brands for that matter. And then, so then the other releases are the Thinlits, and this is the Vault Edges. So it's got these cool edge dies in there that cut just the edge. So they don't cut anywhere else. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in where you want to place that die to get any of these edges to create. And then there is also an alphabet in there as well. There is Vault Industrial, which has a combination of some great steampunk industrial dies from several collections and sets from in the past. And then there is Vault Noteworthy, which again is kind of a combination of some previous releases, and just all of these are in completely different sizes than the original ones, and much smaller. I will say that though, they are much smaller than the original ones. I don't have all of the original ones of all of these, but I do with some of them, and they're significantly smaller. And then the last one is Atomic Retro, and again, a combination of different sets that kind of fit that theme as well. So lots to choose from and play with here. And yeah, so I am going to get into my project now. So for this project, I'm going to be working with some new and old dies and embossing folders. So I've got the Vault Floristry and the Lace embossing folder. And then a couple of my favorites are the Scribbly Butterfly. This is the Vault Scribbly Butterfly, and then the Vault Wreath. So as far as some of the other products I'm going to be working with, the paper I'm going to be using is Distress watercolor cardstock. I'm also going to be working with kind of a black, dark silver metallic cardstock and some vellum. The mediums I'm going to be using are some Distress inks in Rusty Hinge, Salvage Patina, Scorched Timber, and then I'm going to be using some Scorched Timber spray stain. I've also got Luster Wax in charcoal, and I'm going to be using the Wow embossing powder called Dirty Verdi, and then some embossing ink. All right, so let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to do is take the lace embossing folder, and I am working on so if you open the folder, this is like the front of it that's got the design printed on it, and you open it up, we're going to be working on that surface, and we're going to be taking the Salvage Patina Distress ink pad and just rubbing it over the surface to get the ink applied to the embossing folder. Just kind of rub it around. If you haven't used the embossing folder first, you might want to just give it a quick little like wipe off, you know, either like with some soap and water or a little rubbing alcohol, and that will remove some of the residue from the manufacturing process and help the ink stick a little bit easier. So then you're going to take your paper. I'm using Distress Watercolor cardstock, and I've got the smooth side facing up here on the back of the embossing folder. And then I'm just going to close the embossing folder onto the paper. And I just want to recommend that you don't want to push the paper all the way up into the fold. It just makes it harder for the embossing folders to close. So, you know, just at least kind of leave a little bit of that gap on the fold, or, you know, I'm working with a little bit smaller paper, so I'm just going to center it here. And then you can close that, and then you're going to place it into your sandwich that you're going to use for embossing. And I like to kind of turn it just a little, kind of skew it just a little bit so it's not going straight through the machine. It kind of makes it go through a little easier. And then I'll just run that through. One more time. That's not really necessary, but I'm going to just do that to make sure I get a good impression here. And then there you can see how that ink that we rubbed on the surface was then transferred over onto the paper. Now, if you want this darker, what you need to do is dry this with your heat tool and then repeat that process. And you can just kind of line up your paper. You know, I always kind of slide it around until it kind of locks in place, and then kind of help, you know, hold it in place as you close it. And then you can run it back through. But the big thing you want to do is make sure that this is dry, so that as you're layering that ink, it builds up those layers instead of blending. Because if the ink is still wet, the color is just going to blend and it doesn't get quite as dark. So if you want it a little darker, you can repeat that inking process. And then once you're done with the embossing folder, you know, you can just spritz that with a little water and then just wipe it off with a cloth of some sort or a paper towel. So we are finished with the embossing, and now we're going to continue to add some color and interest to this background. So I've got the Rusty Hinge Distress ink, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just lay it on top of the paper and just gently rub the ink pad over the surface. And as you can see, that ink is then transferring to the kind of raised areas of the embossing folder. And this is where you can kind of see, especially if you don't push hard, and you don't want to push hard. We're not trying to get it down into where we put the salvage patina. So some of these areas are a little bit higher than others. Like this inside here, this is a little bit lower than that area that has the ink on it. So if you want to get a little bit into those areas that are a little bit lower, then you can just kind of go with the corner. I like to kind of use my finger and then just kind of hold it at a slight angle, and again still just really barely tapping it down, and then you can kind of rub that ink into those areas as well. Another option could be to use a brayer, but I feel like with the brayer you're going to be really more limited to just getting it on those more raised areas. I feel like you have a little more control of getting it into those little bit lower areas if you use the ink pad. So there is where we are at this point. Now, if you like the way this looks, then I would skip to the next steps here. But what I'm going to do is add some sprays of water to kind of get those inks flowing and give it a little bit more of a distressed kind of grungy feel. And this is just kind of slow triggers, pulling that. You could spray some on your hand and flick it onto the paper if you like. And then from here, you can either just let this air dry, or you can use your heat tool and speed up that drying process. For instance, if you want some more, water in an area that maybe you don't have it, you can also just kind of use your finger to tap it on there and have a little more control of where that interest gets added. I like to call this finger painting a little bit. And then I can kind of spread that around a little bit more. But as you can see, as we've added that water, those inks have activated because they're water-based, and then they start kind of flowing and blending with each other. So if you want to have more of that blend happening, then just add some more water and or bigger droplets of water, and then just continue that process. Another option to help speed up the drying, you could also use like a paper towel or a rag to dab off some of that excess water. However, that will kind of lift off the ink and give you a little bit more of like and kind of lighten the color that's there. And I don't want to remove any of the color, so I'm going to just make sure I dry this all the way. But like I said, you could also just set this to the side and let it air dry. So then once that is completely dry, I cut this a little larger than what I want to use for my finished card. So I'm going to just use my paper trimmer and trim this down now to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. Now I'm going to take that Sizzix luster wax, and this is in charcoal, which is kind of like a dark silver kind of black color. And I'm going to get a little bit on my finger, and then I'm going to just rub it onto my craft mat to kind of spread it out and make it more even, and then kind of wipe off if there's any big chunks of it. And then I'm just going to take my finger, kind of keeping it really nice and flat, and just lightly rub over some of the areas on the background here. I'm not looking for like full coverage anywhere. I just want to add a little bit of interest here and there. So do a little bit here and a little bit there. Kind of move that. So just kind of doing it in areas where it kind of moves that color across the background and kind of keeps your eye moving a little bit. So of course, if you want it darker, just, you know, put more on. Like I said, I'm not looking for full on coverage. I don't want to cover up all that inking that we did. So there we are. And like I said, if you want more, add more. Just kind of go with how you like the look of it. Like I said, I don't want it all the way across the whole paper, just kind of here and there across the background. And then that will easily clean up with just a little bit of rubbing alcohol. And sometimes I even just clean off my glove as well, so I don't have quite as much of that on there. I can reuse my gloves. All right, and so the last step I'm going to do for the background here is to take some of the Scorched Timber Distress ink and an ink blending tool, and I'm just going to just ink the edges a little bit just to darken it up a little more. Add another little bit of interest. As is always the case with this sort of, you know, background creating, you can kind of stop whenever you want. You know, if you, like I said at the very beginning, like if you liked just that embossed paper with the ink on it, then you don't need to continue on with this. So, and like you could use different colors to ink the edges. Like you could go in with a darker blue color if you liked, if you wanted something a little more bright. But of course, I'm going with a little bit more of a grungy feel here. So there is a look at the finished background. And now I'm just going to get into a little bit on how I created the embellishments that I used on the card. So here I just wanted to share with you this same technique using that original standard embossing folder. So this was applying the distress ink to the embossing folder and then placing the paper in the folder and running it through my die cutting machine. So it looks very similar to what we created with the original one as far as the effect of the ink getting down into that embossed design. And then when you take the rusty hinge and just rub that over the surface, again, you're going to get that interest added to the raised areas. But on this folder, there's only one level of raised design. So while it still looks really interesting and you're getting that mix and you're, you know, able to add multiple colors, the level of interest and dimension are not quite the same. But that said, if you do have these original embossing folders or just any standard embossing folder, this technique that I'm sharing with you can be used with these folders. So I took some distressed watercolor cardstock and die cut it with one of the butterflies from the Vault Scribbly butterflies, and I'm going to be doing some ink smishing here with this. So I'm just going to smush that ink pad. This is Rusty Hinge. Spritz it with a little water, and then I'm just going to smash my die cut into the ink here. And there's lots of ways you can add ink to die cuts. This just happens to be one of my favorite ways. And then I'm just going to give that a dry. And just be careful when you're drying that you don't burn your fingers. So you can use like a silicone mat like this if you need to protect your work surface, or hold onto it with some tweezers if you need to. And then, again, if you want to make this darker in color, once it's dry, then you can just dip it back into the ink here and get a little more color on there if you like. And then dry again. And it's fine if there's like areas here where it doesn't have any color. That's not a big deal. If you want it more solid, just add some ink there. And then we want to get this really nice and dry before we do this next step. Now, I'm going to take some Distress Embossing ink and just a little sponge dauber, and I'm just going to apply some of the ink kind of here and there on the die cut. So it doesn't have to be all over, just kind of little spots here and there. And I'm going to put this on top of a piece of printer paper that's just been folded in half. And now I'm just going to sprinkle on some of that Dirty Verdi embossing powder. And again, I didn't want solid coverage, so I'm actually going to use my finger here and tap off a little bit of some of that just to give it a little more distressed effect as well. And I'm going to put the excess powder here back into my jar. And now I'm going to use my heat embossing gun to melt the powder. And as you can see, I've got a pair of tweezers here to help me hold this so that I don't burn my fingers. And you want to just make sure you turn your gun on, let it warm up, and then start melting the powder. For it to change, and it starts changing color. This particular embossing powder is a little bit difficult to tell when it's melted because of the nature of the powder. So just look for those little subtle changes in it. And then, once you see that, then just move on to the next area there. If you're not totally sure, just give it a second to cool, and then you can always kind of touch it. And if some of it's starting to flake off a little bit, then you probably need to heat that area a little bit more. So then the next step with this die cut piece is I'm just going to add a little bit of some scorched timber distress ink to it just to darken it up a little bit more. I also feel like I wouldn't mind having that Rusty Hinge a little bit more intense, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to re-ink smush this. So add a little more ink there, and then tap that in, and it'll just get into those areas that don't have the embossing powder on them. And then we can just give that a quick dry. And now we're going to go in and just ink that up a little bit with that scorched timber. So there is a look at the finished butterfly that I created for this card. So here's a look at the finished card. As you can see, I've layered on several die cuts onto that butterfly that I created. We took the background and then I die cut a wreath from a piece of distressed watercolor cardstock that I had sprayed with the Scorched Timber Distress Spray Stain, and then adhered that to the background. Then I die cut the shadow layer from the Scribbly Vault butterflies from some vellum. And then I added that die cut that I created in the video here. And then on top of that, I took some of the dies from the Vault Floristry die set and cut some of that black, dark silver metallic cardstock with those. And to give them a little bit of distress and grunge, I took a piece of sandpaper, actually used like the Ranger sanding disc, and then I just lightly sanded the edges of those just to give it that little bit of distressed effect. And then I added on a sentiment with a little bit of double-sided foam adhesive. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this card came together using some of the new embossing folders and dies from Tim Holtz and Sizzix. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend. If you're interested in learning more about working with embossing folders, make sure you check out my most recent class, Stretch Your Embossing Folders. This class is designed for anyone who's interested in learning more about using embossing folders in mixed media. Throughout the class, you'll learn 4 ways to combine embossing folders with inks, sprays, paste, wax, and paint to create a variety of unique effects. Each technique is broken down into easy-to-follow steps to create a stunning background. Check out the link in my description box to learn more. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.